From what I have observed upon the act of the last assembly against the seceding brethren, it is evident that it contains a general condemnation of their testimony, without condescending upon any particular instances of anything adopted by them contrary to the word of God or the laudable acts and constitutions of the Church of Scotland. Yea, by the said act of assembly, all the proceedings of the present judicatories are justified, and the seceding ministers are condemned as casting many groundless and calumnious reflections upon them in their said act and testimony, and in other papers emitted by them. Hence 'tis also plain that the particular steps of defection, both of present and former times, contained in the presbytery's act and testimony, are reckoned injurious and calumnious reflections. The present judicatories, then, are so far from acknowledging their iniquity and returning to the Lord, that they condemn the seceding ministers for bearing testimony unto the truth. They not only refuse to lift up a judicial testimony for truth themselves, but they condemn others who are endeavoring to do it. Therefore, I cannot but look upon this procedure as an instance that they are worse than when the protestation was entered against the Assembly, 1733. And from all the above particular instances that I have given, the author of the essay may see that the present judicatories are worse, yea, vastly worse, than when the said protestation was entered. As also he may see that the grounds of secession from the present judicatories, as the same was stated before the Commission of the General Assembly, 1733, do still subsist, and that the procedure of the judicatories from time to time has been such as not only gives just ground for the seceding brethren to continue in their secession, but also to enlarge the same further than it was stated before the Commission of the General Assembly, anon 1733. I shall only further observe upon the present proceedings of the judicatories, that having thrust out from communion with them some ministers, because they were contending with the said judicatories against several steps of defection, these ministers judged it their duty to associate together, that they might testify in a judicial capacity for the truths of God, as also that they might contribute their endeavors in the same capacity for the help and relief of the Lord's oppressed heritage through the land. And now the judicatories will have them to return again to their communion, and if they will not, they threaten to process and libel them. That is, they will have them forced back into their communion, even though the grounds of their secession are so far from being removed that in all the above particular instances named, the said grounds are strengthened and increased. I may therefore leave it to any unbiased person to judge if this is either a consistent or reasonable procedure. I shall now conclude this section with laying before the reader a short sum of the argument for secession from the present judicatories, and for the exercise of the keys in a distinct capacity with them, as I have stated and laid the same in this chapter. That is, this national church as she is represented in her judicatories is not a confessing church. She has not the scriptural character of the church of the living God. In regard, her judicatories refuse to do justice to the truth, in condemning particularly and expressly many gross and pernicious errors that have been brought to their bar, whereby the scheme of divine truth is laid down from the word of God in our confession of faith, is subverted, and also in regard the erroneous have been dismissed from their bar, either without censure or with no censure proportioned to the scandal and offense they have given. In like manner, the said judicatories are tyrannical in their administration, and that not in a few single instances only, but in a series and tract of violence done unto the heritage of God, whereby they not only obtrude ministers upon the church, but even appoint the right hand of fellowship to be given to intruders by such synods and presbyteries as have been reclaiming against such violence, and likewise they appoint and ordain that the members of the church should submit to the ministry of those that are imposed upon them, as if they were lawful and sent ministers of Christ, or otherwise be deprived of the seals of the covenant. And further, this tyranny in the administration is manifested in several acts and deeds, whereby sinful and unwarrantable terms of communion ministerial and Christian communion, have been laid down, and the judicatories of the church do still persist in refusing to do justice to injured truth, as also in their tyranny in the administration. And of late, the most part of ministers having actually submitted unto such usurpations of the civil powers, whereby the courts and judicatories of the Lord's house are held and declared to subsist and stand in a direct subordination unto the said powers. And the present judicatories, having given no manner of testimony at all against the said grievous usurpation, but having continued with a silent submission under the same, their constitution is thereby changed, and they have virtually consented to take their holding with respect to the disposal and ordering of their constituent members and their qualifications directly and immediately of the civil powers. And further, the said judicatories have and do persist and continue in the above and like sinful practices, notwithstanding the ordinary means have been used to reclaim them, particularly by petitions, representations, dissents, and protestations against many of the above practices complained of, by all which they have departed from our received and approved standards of doctrine, worship, government, and discipline, and consequently have broke the bond of ecclesiastical union in this particular visible church. Therefore, a secession from ecclesiastical conjunction and communion with the present judicatories is necessary duty, and until they return to our Reformation standards, and such as are sensible to their duty, and who desire to be found faithful to the Lord in this day of degeneracy and backsliding, have right on their side, both from the Word of God and from the acts and constitutions of this church, from our solemn covenant engagements, and from the engagements that each minister comes under at his ordination to the ministry, but all which they are bound to hold fast, by all which they are bound to hold fast what we in this Reformed church and land have received, as also in regard they cannot otherwise discharge several duties that their station and office oblige them unto, and which the present state of the Church of Christ in this land requires. They have right, I say, to associate together in a distinct judicative capacity from the present judicatories, and that they may display the banner of a testimony for the truths of Christ, for the freedom of his spiritual kingdom and the rights of his subjects, in opposition to the injury that is done to truth, to the invasions that are made upon his spiritual kingdom, and the violence that is done to his subjects, and this as a debt that Zion owes to her God, and as a branch of that revenue of glory and praise that is due from the church unto her exalted head, and as a public debt that he ought to discharge for the sake of the present and succeeding generations. Or that she ought to discharge for the sake of the present and succeeding generations. It is to be regretted that such is the state of matters in the judicatories of this national church, that I have so much ground for laying my argument in the above manner against them. I have been obliged unto it for the defense of that cause which I doubt not is the cause of truth, and which the Associate Presbytery, whereof I am a member, have by their Judicial Act and Testimony espoused. I have in this and the preceding sections endeavored to explain and give my reasons for the verity and truth of the several particulars contained in the above charge, and it is with some measure of concern that I find the conclusion which comes out from the several premises that I have laid down may be expressed in the following terms. That is, since the present judicatories of this national church refuse to confess the truths of God in direct opposition unto such dangerous errors whereby they have been subverted, and since by several particular acts and deeds they are tyrannical in their administration, and since they are constituent of such members as are obtruded upon the church, and therefore have no right nor warrant from the head of the church to sit in his courts, nor to rule and govern his flock, yea, constitute of such members, who are scattering the flock of Christ, and ruling over them with force and rigor, by which and the like practices they have given said judicatories, scandal and offense to the church of God, as also since the said judicatories have, by their silent submission unto the usurpations that have been made upon the kingdom of Christ and the courts thereof, virtually and practically given up with their holding of the King of Zion, whereby the constitution and several judicatories of this national church is changed. And finally, since they continue to justify themselves in these and the like practices, therefore, for the above and for all the other reasons that have been more particularly specified and expressed, the present judicatories of this national church cannot be held, nor repute, as lawful or right constitute courts of Christ, and consequently it is the duty of such as desire to be found faithful to the Lord to come out from among them, and to make use of the keys of government and discipline for the ends and purposes for which they are given unto the office bearers of the church by her glorious and exalted head. And, in like manner, it is the duty of all who fear the Lord through the land, and who desire to hold fast that Reformation purity once attained unto, steadfastly to adhere unto any testimony emitted by such office-bearers for the truths of God, and against a course of defection and deviation from them, whether in present or former times, The command being given to all members of the church according to their different spheres and stations, to stand fast in one spirit, with one mind, striving together for the faith of the gospel. Philippians 1, verse 27. Chapter 3, wherein the arguments advanced by the author of the essay against secession from the present judicatories are examined. The author of the essay proceeds in his 5th chapter to give us what he calls his weighty arguments against separation. But, since he has never distinctly stated the question, I cannot expect to find that his arguments shall be laid in a fair or plain manner. Sometimes they seem to be leveled against the sectarian separatists, sometimes against a book called Plain Reasons, etc. But since it is in his title page he states the seceding brethren as his only adversaries, I shall consider his arguments as directed against the conduct of the Associate Presbytery, whom he thinks fit to class with the worst schismatics and separatists. In his preamble to his arguments, in the beginning of his 5th chapter, quote, separation, says he, from a true church, except in the above or like cases, was always reckoned a heinous sin by the judicious and tender, albeit her faults should be many, unquote. I have already noticed the ambiguity in the terms true church as used by him, but the above and like cases, he means the cases mentioned in his 4th. He means the cases mentioned in his 4th chapter, wherein he mentions 6 general grounds of separation, and I have likewise observed that he is neither distinct nor plain upon any of them, except upon the 5th, when he tells us on page 25, quote, that such ministers as are evidently scandalous may be withdrawn from, albeit, through the iniquity of the times, they should not be censured by a church judicatory when complained of, unquote. And here I might ask our author, whether or not such are evidently scandalous, who have had an active hand in obtruding ministers upon the church, or who have practically given up the sole headship and sovereignty of Christ over his spiritual kingdom, or who have pled that self-interest must bear the sway in all our actions whatsoever. Whether or not, I say, such persons are evidently scandalous, or if they have given just ground of offense unto the church and people of God. If our author will grant that they are scandalous, then how is he consistent with himself in continuing to maintain ecclesiastical communion with them, when, through the iniquity of times, they are not censured by a church judicatory, though they have been often complained of? I know not what our author reckons evidently scandalous, but I doubt not to affirm that such as are guilty of an open and public violation of several express commands of the first table of the moral law, and who justify themselves in the same, are equally scandalous and more dangerous to the church as these who may be guilty of the open violation of the express commands of the second table of the same law, though the latter ought likewise to be censured by every church judicatory. The author of the essay is likewise plain upon his 6th general ground of separation, that is, quote, that the imposing and least sinful term of communion is just ground of separation from a church, unquote. I have already evinced that unwarrantable and sinful terms of communion are by several acts and deeds imposed upon the ministers and members of this church, as also that our conjunction with the present judicatories does in itself bind us up from the discharge of several duties, which our ministerial office and our ordination vows and engagements do oblige us unto, in the present state of matters in this national church. I might therefore pass over all our author's arguments as nowise affecting the present question betwixt the present judicatories and the seceding ministers, but in regard his divine and human authorities, though very much misapplied, are yet illustriously managed to the prejudice of the cause of truth. I shall briefly consider them after I have noticed what he mentions in his preamble concerning the Emperor Constantine, who, he tells us, was so afflicted with the dissensions of the church in his day that they brought many a tear from his eyes, and robbed him of his night's rest. As the Arian heresy was the occasion of these great dissensions of the church of Constantine's time, so if the indignities that have been done to the person of Christ in our day, and the injuries that have been done to many important and precious truths, had drawn tears from the eyes of ministers and other church members, the banner of a judicial testimony had been displayed long ere now by the judicatories for injured and wounded truth, after the example of the Council of Nicaea, which was assisted and countenanced by that great emperor. As for Mr. King's dying exhortation in the words of the Apostle, Philippians 2 verse 3, as our author joins him in it, so I hope all the seceding ministers do in like manner cordially join in the same. I proceed now to consider our author's arguments against secession in the following sections.